The Afro-Asiatic Semitic versus the Core-Araxes Hurrian. What are the differences between Afro-Asiatic Semites and the Core-Araxes Hurrians? There are actually several differences. First, let's begin with origin and language. Where is the best place for the origins of Afro-Asiatic Semites? Also, what language do Semites speak? This is from Proto-Afro-San lexicon confirming West Asian homeland pastoralism by Alexander Mettorev, and it reads, the article presents one more step towards the equation of the culture of speakers of Proto-Afro-San, reconstructed on the basis of paleo-linguistic data, with the early Neolithic post-Natufian culture of the Levant. According to the gladio-chronological method of S. A. Starstring, Proto-Afro-San is dated back to approximately 10,000 BC, the same period as post-Natufian, supposed to be the cradle of agriculture and livestock breeding on the planet, as far as radiocarbon dating tells us. The article offers evidence for the presence of a layer of pastoral lexicon in Proto-Afro-San in the form of 26 reconstructed names for large and small cattle and various other pastoral terms. The objective of the present paper is to present further evidence in time referring to pastoralism presumably practiced by the Proto-Afro-San speaking community, for the identification of this community with the early Levantine villagers associated with the early Neolithic post-Natufian culture. These villagers left some of the earliest known archaeological evidence for the cultivation of domesticated crops, cereals, and the raising of domestic livestock. It is for archaeologists to evaluate the correspondence between the archaeological evidence from the Levant as well as adjacent regions and the reconstructed terminology referring to incipient agro-pastoralism in the Proto-Afro-San language, date by the new version of the linguistic method of gladiochronology to approximately the same period and presumably the same area. This is part of a broader project aimed at drawing the most comprehensive picture featuring practically all aspects of life of early Neolithic people in the Near East, which can be drawn from the reconstructed Proto-Afro-San lexicon, namely terms referring to people and society, economic life and technology, intellectual culture, and natural and physical environments. This is from the Prehistory of a Dispersal, the Proto-Afro-San Afro-Asiatic Farming Lexicon, and it reads, the identification of Proto-Afro-Sans as Natufians and post-Natufians seems to satisfy all the four criteria. Besides the farming lexicon, there are sets of reconstructed Proto-Afro-San terms pointing to incipient animal breeding, a wide variety of dwelling and settlement types, a territory characterized by both desert and steppe forest type of terrain, and drying riverbeds, as well as deep permanent streams, a vegetation typical of such terrain, and the animals whose bones have been found at the Natufian and early Neolithic post-Natufian sites. Interestingly, there is a large number of common Afrosan terms denoting flocked gullet animals, usually inhabiting steppes and semi-deserts. Finally, the Levant appears to be an attested region from where populations began to spread starting in the early Neolithic, covering not only wide tracts of southwestern Asia, but also the adjacent parts of the Mediterranean and Africa. And this book is from Cambridge and it reads, given the modern distribution of Semitic languages over the area in question, which belong to the larger Afro-Asiatic family, it seems appropriate to suggest that these first farmers of the Levant and their Mesolithic predecessors, including the Natufian culture, were speaking a Proto-Afro-Asiatic language. It may be that Proto-Semitic continued to develop within the Levant and Syria area, since both Abelite and Akkadian, early Semitic languages, are there attested early, the former around 2400 BC. So basically, from what I read when it comes to all of this, the Proto-Afro-Asiatics or the Proto-Afrosans are basically the Natufians. They spoke an early form of an Afro-Asiatic language. We can tell this due to the farming lexicon, and the Natufians are some of the world's first farmers and pastoralists. Their descendants, the pre-pottery Neolithic cultures of the Levant, and these peoples would basically represent the ancestors of Semites. And geographically, all of this is being taken place within the Levant. The area of Natufian culture stretched from Sinai all the way up to modern day Syria. Same thing with the Proto-Semitic people. They stretch from Sinai all the way up into modern day Syria. And this is where we see again the earliest forms of pastoralism, agriculture, and Afro-Asiatic languages. It's all been taking place within the Levant. So, where is the best place of origin for the Core-Araxes Hurrians? And what language did Hurrians speak? This is from Prehistory and Protohistory of Ancient Cultures. So it reads, the Core-Araxes, a cultural tradition of the late 4th and 3rd millennium BC, has recently become a focus of international archaeological research. It was first discovered in the mountains of the Tartarus and the South Caucasus. From near the beginning of the tradition, evidence suggests that populations bearing some of its hallmarks, black burnished, handmade pottery, and a ritual of the hearth, spread out over a wide range of the Tartarus, Zagros, and Caucasus Mountains, and as far south as the area of the Sea of Galilee in the southern Levant. And this is another reading, but it's titled Ancient Turkey, and it reads, instead, the greater part of the population still lived in villages, with a rural lifestyle that involved tilling the land and raising stock. Around 3500 BC, or slightly earlier, the character of the eastern Anatolian highlands began to change, reflected primarily by the appearance of visually striking pottery fired with a red and black color spectrum, handmade, well burnished, and often decorated with Semites form one of the most distinctive archaeological horizons of the ancient Near East. Referred to in literature as Kura-Araxes, early Trans-Caucasian, or Koraz, the suit of material culture stretched across a remarkable wide area, encompassing East Anatolia and the Turkish Upper Euphrates, Southern Caucasus, and northwestern Iran. It has also been found in considerable quantity in later Early Bronze Age contacts in the Aquum, where Robert and Linda Braidwood designated it red-black burnished wire, a term that emphasizes the distinctive color spectrum. Further south still, a related artifact assemblage occurs in the Levant, where its conspicuous presence comes in a derivative form named after the site of Kura-Araxes in northern Israel. And this is from Core-Araxes from the lexostatistical viewpoint, and it reads, the Core-Araxes linguistic family consists of two closely related languages, Hurrian with several dialects, and Araxes. Despite the chronological distance between the attested Hurrian and Araxes, it seems clear that the latter is not a direct descendant of the former, but the two languages represent two separate branches of a common proto-language, Proto-Core-Araxes. For the pre-literate period, it is natural to associate the Core-Araxes people with the Core-Araxes early Transcaucasian archaeological culture. And this is from Encyclopedia of Indo-European Culture, and it reads, in the period immediately prior to the emergence of the Hurrians, the northern area of their distribution was occupied by the Kura-Araxes culture, circa 3400 through 2500 BC. The distribution of Core-Araxes sites would encompass the territory of the Eto and Araxes, as well as the northern part of the Hurrians. It is often presumed that the Core-Araxes culture is an archaeological reflection of the Hurrians. So basically, from what we've read, the Core-Araxes culture is from whom the Hurrians would descend from, would come from, and this culture existed in the southern Caucasus, eastern Anatolia, and northwestern Iran. So this is the area of the Hurrian Core-Araxes culture. And linguistically, these people would have been Caucasian speakers of the Core-Araxes language. And here is also a map of Core-Araxes when it comes to its language and people in the same area of the Core-Araxes culture because they come from that culture. So basically, we can see differences between Afro-Asiatic Semites and the Core-Araxes Hurrians. Afro-Asiatic Semitic populations have their origins in the Levant with Natufians, whereas the Core-Araxes Hurrians have their origins in the southern Caucasus. The migratory patterns of these two populations is also very different. The Afro-Asiatic Semitic populations migrated from the Levant into Mesopotamia. This is from the Bayesian phylogenetic analysis of Semitic languages identifies an early Bronze Age origin of Semitic in the Near East, and it reads, and we're going to read what's in yellow. We estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin 5,750 years before present in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia. So to break that down, Semites had their origins in the Levant 5,750 years before present, 5,750 years before present, which would basically be 3750 BC. And this video will show that migration. Copyright disclaimer. Under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Non-profit educational or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. The Core-Araxes Hurrians migrated from the Caucasus into Mesopotamia. This is from a great paper that actually deals with the migration and the origin and the disappearance of the Core-Araxes culture. And it reads, Kohol also reminds us of the evidence of increased militarism from the early to the late Bronze Age, that is reflected in more fortified sites, new weaponry, and an iconography of war as seen on the Khrushchev Cup. Kohol argues that while the number of Core-Araxes settlements decreased in the southern Caucasus, archaeological research indicates that the Core-Araxes culture spread to western Iran in the Zagros region and to the Levant. In Kohol's view, as new groups of people moved in, the Core-Araxes communities abandoned the southern Caucasus and moved further south, where some of them already resided. Others associate the cultures of the post-Core-Araxes period, especially the Troeti culture, with movement of people from the Near East, possibly the expansion of Hurrian tribes. So you have the Core-Araxes culture up here in the southern Caucasus, migrating into eastern Anatolia and northwestern Iran. But as you can see down here, you have the Semites, who would descend from the Proto-Afro-Sans, who would descend from and basically be Natufians. So we can see right here that geographically, these people are in two completely different areas. The Semites are towards the south in the Levant, the Core-Araxes cultures in the north in the Caucasus, and the Core-Araxes culture is moving from the north to the south, and the Semites are moving from the south to the north. So you see that these are completely two different peoples, separated and in two completely different geographical areas, and migrating from completely different areas, moving in the opposite direction. And the Core-Araxes culture is going to move into the Levant, and we read about the Karabic culture, which is going to come from the Core-Araxes culture. But Semites leave and go into Arabia as well. So we can see a difference between the Afro-Asiatic Semites and the Core-Araxes Hurrians. Afro-Asiatic Semitic populations migrated from the Levant into Mesopotamia, whereas the Core-Araxes Hurrians migrated from the Caucasus into Mesopotamia. We can see this from a genetic standpoint as well. Haplogroup J is typically associated with the Core-Araxes Hurrians, and haplogroup E is typically associated with the Afro-Asiatic Semites. This is from the paper How Eurasia Was Born, and it reads, the Northeast Caucasian language family seems to show clear links to ancient Eastern Anatolia, as most subclades of J1-Z1842 TMRCA is 4300 BCE can be linked to the Armenian highlands in present-day Azerbaijan, precisely fitting the exact location of the Core-Araxes culture, 3400 BCE through 2000 BCE. Three subclades of it, J1-ZS3042 TMRCA is 3500 BCE, J1-ZS5 J1-658 TMRCA is 2800 BCE, J1-ZS2872 2800 BCE, and J1-Y5353 TMRCA is 2500 BCE, are widespread among Northeast Caucasian groups, suggests Northeast Caucasian languages to have originated from the Core-Araxes culture, as ancient J1 subclades also seem to have been present in the ancient Levant as well. This supports the existence of the Aldoan language family linking Hurrian to Northeast Caucasian. So haplogroup J is connected to the Core-Araxes Hurrians, Northeast Caucasians in ancient times. Now, as for the Afro-Asiatics, the Proto-Afro-Asiatic group carrying the E-P2 mutation may have appeared at this point in time and subsequently gave rise to the different major population groups, including current speakers of the Afro-Asiatic languages and pastoralist populations. This is from the paper Y chromosome E haplogroups, their distribution and implication to the origin of Afro-Asiatic languages and pastoralism. Proto-Afro-Asiatics would have carried the haplogroup E marker. So, the Hurrian populations penetrated into Mesopotamia, whereas the Semitic populations were already there. It was likely the Hurrian populations that destroyed Semitic kingdoms like Ebla and Akkad. When the kingdom of Akkad fell, circa 2190 BCE, the Hurrians and others exploited the constant power vacuum in Mesopotamia. The admixture time also overlaps with the rise and fall of the Akkadian Empire, which controlled the region from Iran to the Levant between 4.4 and 4.2 KYA. The Akkadian collapse is argued to have been the result of a widespread aridification event around 4,200 years, possibly caused by a volcanic eruption. Archaeological evidence in this period documents large-scale influxes of refugees from northern Mesopotamia towards the south, where cities and villages became overpopulated. Future sampling of ancient DNA from northern Syria and Iraq may reveal if these migrants carried the Iranian Chalcolithic-related ancestry we observe in Bronze Age Sidon and Jordan. This is from the paper Continuity and Admixture in the Last 5 Millennia of Levantine History from Ancient Canaanite and Present-Day Lebanese Genome Sequences. And this next paper, titled Genomic History of Neolithic to Bronze Age Anatolia, Northern Levant and Southern Caucasus. This deals with the fall of Ebla. The other paper dealt with the fall of Akkad. Starting what's in red at the word however. However, written sources, archaeological, and paleoclimatic evidence suggests that a narrower time period, the end of the early Bronze Age, had been very critical with respect to political tensions and population mobility. It was during this period, for example, that Ebla was destroyed twice and re-established at the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age. There are extensive textual references from the end of the early Bronze Age through the late Bronze Age, referring to groups of people arriving into the area of the Akwam Valley, although these groups were named likely based on designations. Amorites, Hurrians, again, we met with the Hurrians. The formative context of their cultural identity and their geographic origins remains debated. One recent hypothesis associates the arrival of these groups with climate-forced population movement during the 4.2 kp BP event, a mega drought that led to the abandonment of the entire Kabir River valley in northern Mesopotamia and the search of nearby habitable areas. And that fits exactly with what went on here, because this paper talks about how groups in northern Mesopotamia began to migrate southwards to southern Mesopotamia, where villages and cities became overpopulated. And this paper right here is talking about who those groups would be. People like Hurrians, and they would be migrating from northern Mesopotamia to other parts towards the south because of various climatic changes like mega droughts and such. So it's interesting how this all comes together. But with these migrations of people came the destruction of certain empires like Ebla, kingdoms like Ebla, and empires like the Akkadians, both being Semitic kingdoms and empires being destroyed by these northern populations that likely carried Iranian Chalcolithic related ancestry. So, haplogroup E and Levant's PP&B Natufian ancestry was already present in the Levant and the homeland of Proto-Semites since 4000 BC. Keep in mind, time period, location, very important. Haplogroup J and Zagros Iran related ancestry entered the homeland of Proto-Semites 2,000 years later in 2100 BC after the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. Now let's absorb all of this in. So to keep things blunt and simple, Proto-Semites, they have their origin 4000 BC in the Levant, and haplogroup E was abundant in the Levant. But haplogroup J entered the Levant in 21,000 BC. So haplogroup J is technically 2,000 years too late in order for it to be considered Proto-Semitic, because Proto-Semites had been existing for 2,000 years before J even enters into the homeland of Semites, which is the Levant. Such a scenario would also explain the presence of Y chromosome haplogroup E in the Natufians and Levantine farmers, a common link between the Levant and Africa. We compiled frequencies of Y chromosome haplogroups in this geographical area and their changes over time in a dataset of ancient and modern Levantine populations. And note, similarly to Lazardus et al., that haplogroup J was absent in all Natufian and Neolithic Levant male individuals examined thus far, but emerged during the Bronze Age in Lebanon and Jordan, along with ancestry related to Iran Chalcolithic. And that's very, very fascinating. So haplogroup J was not present in Natufians or Neolithic Levantines, and Natufians and Neolithic Levantines are the first Afro-Asiatic people, the first Semitic people, or whom Semites would come from, and haplogroup J wasn't present. But haplogroup E was present. As a matter of fact, haplogroup E was their Y DNA chromosome. But J came in carrying Iranian DNA much later. So here is the area of Natufian culture, and it overlaps perfectly with the area of Proto-Semites. And J didn't enter in until much, much later. Here is PP&B, haplogroup E in Jordan, haplogroup E in northern Israel, haplogroup E among the Natufians, of course, haplogroup E even in Turkey, by the way, in the Chalcolithic period. But haplogroup J doesn't enter in until 2198 BCE. It is far too late for it to be considered Proto-Semitic. It enters in when Semites had already existed for 2,000 years. It's too late. When the kingdom of Akkad fell, circa 2190 BCE, the Hurrians and others exploited the constant power vacuum in Mesopotamia. So, when the kingdom of Akkad fell, circa 2190 BCE, this also happens to be around the same time we see haplogroup J enter into the Levant, 2198 BCE. It's around the exact same time, because these Hurrians were migrating once Akkad fell and a power vacuum happened because of the fall of a massive empire as Akkad. So again, the Core-Araxes culture is here. Semites are here. Semites migrating to Mesopotamia. Core-Araxes is migrating into Anatolia, Iran, and Mesopotamia as well. And then the Core-Araxes culture passes through Mesopotamia into the Levant, creating the Kura-Araxes culture. Semites are in Arabia, but we can clearly tell that there are two different peoples, and the Core-Araxes culture kind of just dominates and pushes its way through. So the Kura-Araxes culture, let's learn about them. This is from Genetics and the Archaeology of Ancient Israel, and it reads, this geographic distribution of J2A versus J1 mirrors the two autosomal components from Habir et al. 2013. However, several demographic and migratorial events may contribute to the observed Y frequency patterns in the southern Levant. Major J2A lineages whose origin is likely from East Anatolia, Armenia, Georgia, and northwest Iran could have migrated to the southern Levant during the early Bronze Age through the movement of the Core-Araxes horizon to Lebanon, Syria, and ultimately the Galilee area marked by the Kura-Araxes culture. And that's what I was showing you earlier. Furthermore, haplogroup J being connected to the Core-Araxes culture and the movement of those peoples and them moving into the Levant, just to show you that migration. Again, the Core-Araxes here, the Semites are here, but the Core-Araxes will push their way through the Semites and create the Kura-Araxes culture, which is what we're reading about. So starting right here, it says, later immigration from a similar East Anatolian source may have brought Hurrian Osnomatics to the southern Levant during the Middle Bronze Age. These events may have added J2A to an underlying J1 substratum. So again, we see haplogroup J2, haplogroup J1. They are connected to the Core-Araxes horizon and the Kura-Araxes culture, as well as the Hurrians, which would mean J is mostly a Caucasian type of lineage, but it originates in the Caucasus, so that makes sense. And again, these findings contrast with both earlier Neolithic and Epipaleolithic Levantine populations, which were dominated by haplogroup E, and later Bronze Age individuals, all of whom belong to haplogroup J. That is from Ancient DNA from Chalcolithic Israel, reveals the role of population mixture in cultural transformation. So haplogroup E, it was dominated by Neolithic and Epipaleolithic Levantine populations, which would be the first farmers and pastoralists who eventually give rise to Proto-Semites. This is why Semites will have haplogroup E. But later people came in during the Bronze Age, and they had haplogroup J. So, therefore, haplogroup J isn't Semitic in origin because it's 2,000 years too late to be Semitic. Haplogroup J is a Core-Araxes Hurrian type of lineage in origin. We know historically that Hurrians were known for adopting and assimilating into other cultures, so much so that they have become invisible to history. This is from World History Encyclopedia titled The Hurrians, and it reads, it was likely that the Hurrian conquest of that region was a complex phenomenon, including peaceful migration, infiltration by mercenary bands in the pay of local city-states, followed by the rise to power of mercenary warlords, culminating in the eventual full-scale migration of Hurrian herding tribes out of the mountains into the more fertile river valleys. Further, the Hurrians often seem to have adopted the culture of the city-states they conquered, making them less visible than ever in the historical record. So they became more invisible because once you start to adopt the culture of the other people, it's kind of hard to determine who's who if they're both practicing the same culture. So it says, for example, we have no evidence of a distinctive Hurrian military system. It seems that if ever there were a people who were both everywhere and nowhere, it was the Hurrians. The Hurrians were all over the ancient Near East. But at the same time, it's kind of hard to tell who they are because, well, frankly, they adopted the culture of the people that they were around. So it's like, how do I tell? However, DNA has brought them to light. That is how we can tell today. Haplogroup J is the paternal lineage of the Core-Araxes Hurrians. It was haplogroup J and FM89 lineages that adopted the Semitic languages from haplogroup E. This is from In Hot Pursuit of Language and Prehistory, and it reads, the presence of Semitic in the Near East might be explained as follows. Early pre-Proto-Semitic speakers would have migrated into Syro-Palestine before the Neolithic, being taken by the M35 bearers, specifically M35/78, and adopted by populations bearing M89 lineages. So the early Proto-Semitic people had haplogroup E-M35, but FM89 lineages adopted the Semitic language from haplogroup E. FM89, by the way, represents about 90% of the world's population, and J descends from haplogroup F. So when it says, and adopted by populations bearing M89 lineages, that would include haplogroup J as well, when they adopted the Semitic language from haplogroup E bearers, E-M35 bearers. So, this is from Genetics of African Populations in Health and Disease, and it reads, for example, Underhill et al. 2000 state that the V38/M35 lineage was carried into the Near East from Africa in the Mesolithic. These V38/M35 in Africa corresponds to the TAQI49AFV. It is far more likely that pre-Proto-Semitic speakers went into the Near East at this time, where Semitic languages have long since dominated. But the predominant haplotypes in most Semitic-speaking populations are variants 7 and 8 in the TAQI49AF system, which are equivalent to M89 associated lineages. So basically, group 7 and group 8 is FM89 lineages, like I explained earlier. The most parsimonious explanation is that ancestral Semitic was adopted by those bearing haplotypes 7 and 8. So just like from what we read over here, when it talks about FM89 lineages adopting Semitic languages, and FM89 representing most of the world's population, including haplogroup J, this book basically says the exact same thing, that ancestral Semitic was adopted by those bearing haplotypes 7 and 8, basically FM89 lineages, but the original people who spoke the pre-Proto-Semitic language would have been V38/M35 haplogroup, basically haplogroup E. And here's another section dealing with it. This is titled Haplogroup F-M89 Familipedia, and it reads, however, certain subclades of haplogroup E, which commonly occurs among all modern populations of Africa, are also closely associated with the distribution of Afro-Asiatic languages, both within Africa and in Southwest Asia, which many scholars have taken to support the hypothesis of a Northeast African origin of the Afro-Asiatic languages and subsequent colonization of Southwest Asia by haplogroup E3b bearing Proto-Semites. Again, haplogroup E being linked to Proto-Semites. Under the scenario of an African origin of Afro-Asiatic languages, the occurrence of Eurasian Y chromosome haplogroups J, K, and R among Afro-Asiatic speaking populations of North Africa and East Africa would imply Eurasian immigration or gene flow into Northern Africa, accompanied by the loss of the Eurasians' ancestral language and assimilation into the indigenous Afro-Asiatic cultures. So again, it says right there, basically, Eurasian Y chromosome haplogroups like J, K, and R, they would have lost their Eurasian ancestral language, and they would have assimilated into the indigenous Afro-Asiatic culture. So again, this shows you that haplogroups like J, K, and R originally are not Afro-Asiatic people. They originally did not have an Afro-Asiatic language or culture. They had their own ancestral Eurasian language, but they assimilated into indigenous Afro-Asiatic culture and language. So, and the original Afro-Asiatics would have been haplogroup E people. So here's yet again another source dealing with that same very thing. This is titled Genetics, Egypt, and History, Interpreting Geographical Patterns of Y chromosome Variation, and it reads, it can be postulated that select M35 carriers, speakers from Africa of a stage of ancestral Semitic, pre-Proto-Semitic, entered the Near East, where indigenous peoples adopted it and via ongoing language shift and population growth eventually became innumerably greater than the original speakers of the ancestors. So just to sum that up, again, ancestral Semitic people would have carried haplogroup E, and other peoples would have adopted it, and there would have been population boom with those other peoples, and that's why they have more of their chromosome compared to the original ancestral Semites that had haplogroup E. They became innumerably greater than the original speakers of the ancestor, which would have been haplogroup E, the original speakers, and the other people, becoming greater would have been the non-E carrying people like J markers, and they would have had speaking Semitic languages. And this paper also basically says the exact same thing. EUpedia, titled Haplogroup J1, and it reads, looking at the map of J1-P58, it is easy to assume that P58 is a marker of Arabic ancestry because it reaches its maximum frequency in and around the Arabian Peninsula. That would be an oversimplification. It is important to make clear distinction between people who speak Arabic and those who are genetically Arabic. These are two completely different things. So when people say that, oh, most of the Arabian Peninsula has J, therefore J is the originator of Arabs, that's an oversimplification, and there's a difference from someone who speaks Arabic and someone who's genetically Arabic. So for comparison, people who speak languages descend from Latin, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Latin, and Romanian are not necessarily descendant from the ancient Romans of the Latium. Even those who do may not have more than a tiny fraction of their genome, which was inherited from actual Roman ancestors. This is why most Romance language speakers today cannot be considered as genetically Roman. Most present-day Arabic speakers outside the Arabian Peninsula are likewise only very partially or not all Arabic genetically. In the northern half of the Middle East, most of the people who call themselves Arabs of today are in fact mainly descendants of other historic peoples such as the Phoenicians, Assyrians, Babylonians, or even the Hurrians. Again, we're met right back with the Hurrians. Most of these peoples are predominantly J2, with many minority haplogroups like E1B1B, G, J1, L, Q, R1A, R1B, and T. The other subclades of J1 cannot be considered to be the paternal descendants of the first speakers of Arabic. These other J1 lineages were Arabicized alongside haplogroups J2, Q1B, etc. So let's break that down. So basically, J1, it's not the paternal lineage of the first speakers of Arabic. Basically, J1 would not have been the Proto-Arabians who first spoke the Arabic language. J1 was Arabicized as well as J2. So let's finish the reading. It says, Like J1-P58, E-M34, it is also shared with their Semitic cousins, the Jews. Haplogroup E1B1B is considered the prime candidate for the origin and dispersal of Afro-Asiatic languages across northern and eastern Africa and Southwest Asia. The Semitic languages appear to have originated within a subclade of the M34 branch of E1B1B. So again, haplogroup E is associated with Afro-Asiatic people and the first speakers of the Semitic language. And here is yet again another reading. Haplogroup J1 is definitely not Semitic in origin, and it reads, haplogroup J1 is not a Semitic haplogroup in origin. However, genetically, we cannot call this haplogroup Semitic because Semitic people mainly have the FGC11 lineage of this haplogroup in those areas. As Arabic society is mainly based on a unique cluster of J1 haplogroup FGC11, it is wrong to call all people with J1 as Semitic in this sense. We cannot attribute haplogroup J1 to Semitic origin. In fact, it is apparent that there are various clusters of J1 among Caucasian, European, and South/Central Asian people, especially in Caucasus. J1 seems in high or medium amounts among various ethnic groups such as, I'm just going to read some of them, but these are basically Caucasian peoples, the Luzgians, the Avars, the Dergians, Sarsians, Chechens, Bulgars, Azerbaijanis, Turks, etc. All of these people speak various languages which are bound up with Northeast Caucasian languages, Northwest Caucasian languages, and Turkic languages. And European people having J1 also speak Indo-European languages rather than Semitic languages. So basically, to sum that up, is basically most people who have haplogroup J, specifically J1, most of them are non-Semitic speakers. Most are either Northeast Caucasian speakers, Northwest Caucasian speakers, Turkic speakers, or Indo-European speakers. Haplogroup J1 has its highest frequency of speakers under the non-Semitic family of languages, and that's very important to note. So the blue bar means J1-FGC11, which is a unique lineage among Arabs. On the other hand, the other lineages would seem among Europeans, Caucasians, and Turks rather than Arabs. This means J1 haplogroup isn't of Semitic origin. So like I just read, this blue bar is specifically J1-FC11, J1-FGC11. And it's only pretty much this one specific subclade is only pretty much seen in, like I said, Arabs. But you see a more diverse variety of J1 subclades among non-Semitic people, among Europeans and Caucasians and Turks, etc. Which goes to show you that J haplogroup as its whole is mostly a non-Semitic haplogroup. Its highest diversity is among non-Semitic people. But only this one branch of J is Semitic. That's an issue. And that goes to show you why haplogroup J1 isn't Semitic in origin. This one specific branch became Semitic, or really, should I say, adopted Semitic. It is also known that the mostly seen haplogroups in Afro-Asiatic speakers is the lineages of E1B, such as V12, V32, and M81. E1B is one of the most common haplogroups in Semitic people in the Levant and Mesopotamia. In the meantime, E-V12 seems to be a part of Nile Basin and Arabia, and E-M81 is related to Northwest Africa. Based on Arab genealogical tradition, the Adonites are Arabized Arabs, whereas the Khwatanite tribes are thought to be pure Arabs, the local people of Arabia. Today, in genetic projects, we see that most of people from Khwatani tribes are usually related to the lineages of E1B1, whereas Adonites are mostly related to haplogroup J1. The main source of Afro-Asiatic languages are the lineages of E1B1, such as M2, V12, V32, U174, V22, etc., which spread the Levant during the early period of ancient Egypt and later towards Mesopotamia in the east. Semitic languages such as Hebrew, Arabic, and Amharic are categorized under the Afro-Asiatic language family. This means that Arabic and Hebrew languages derive from the same language with Berber, Chadic, Cushitic, Egyptian, Amharic, and Omotic languages of Afro-Asiatic language family in North Africa. Today we see that the most of Afro-Asiatic people are of E1B1B haplogroup, especially the lineages of V12, V32, M81, and we see a great variety of E1B lineages among both Semitic and Afro-Asiatic people, whereas only FGC11 lineage of J1 is present among Afro-Asiatic Semitic people. So only this one branch of J1, which is FGC11, that one branch of J1 is among Semitic people, which goes to show you that J1 has nothing to do with Afro-Asiatic people or even Semites in origin. So it says, and it is also impossible to see J1 haplogroup among several Afro-Asiatic people such as Berbers, etc. So it even says it right there. According to the theory, Afro-Asiatic languages spread to Asia via E1B haplogroup, not J1 haplogroup. It is historically known that a ruling elite class of Afro-Asiatic people, Akkadians, Assyrians, etc., also invaded the north of Mesopotamia and brought their Afro-Asiatic languages to the central and northern parts of Mesopotamia during the period of the Akkadians and Babylonians. Elite dominance model of E1B1 might be supposed for Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians. In this sense, it might be theorized that Sumerian was the main language of the ancient Mesopotamians before Afro-Asiatic E1B overwhelmed Mesopotamia elite dominance model. So, what other methods can we use to determine an Afro-Asiatic Semite from a Core-Araxes Hurrian? We know Afro-Asiatic populations would carry haplogroup E, and we also know that the Core-Araxes Hurrians would carry haplogroup J. So what else can distinguish these people? We can look at the ancient genetic ancestry of Middle Eastern populations because genetically there are basically two types of Middle Eastern people. This is from the genomic history of the Middle East, and it reads, Arabians and Bedouins are positioned close to ancient Levantines, while present-day Levantines are drawn towards Bronze Age Europeans. Iraqi Arabs, Iraqi Kurds, and Assyrians appear relatively closer to ancient Iranians. So let's break this down. So Arabians and Bedouin people are closer to the Levant population, specifically ancient Levantines. That would be your Natufians and such. But present-day Levantines, people in the Levant today, are closer to Bronze Age Europeans, who of course are not Semitic. Also, Iraqi Arabs, Iraqi Kurds, and Assyrians are closer to ancient Iranians. Again, another ancient non-Semitic population. Ancient Iranians would be close to basically Europeans because Iranians are a branch of Europeans. When we substitute Levant Neolithic with Natufians as source of ancestry in the Middle East, we found that Arabians could be successfully modeled. So Arabians are genetically close to Natufians, whereas none of the present-day Levantines could be modeled as such. So none of the present-day Levantines are linked to Natufians. Got it. Model-based clustering also showed that Arabian populations have subsequently lower Anatolian Neolithic ancestry. So Arabians have a very low amount of Anatolian Neolithic DNA compared with modern day Levantines. So modern day Levantines have more of this Anatolian Neolithic DNA. We found an ancestry related to ancient Iranians that is ubiquitous today in all Middle Easterners. Previous studies showed that this ancestry was not present in the Levant during the Neolithic period, but appeared in the Bronze Age, where 50% of the local ancestry was replaced by a population carrying ancient Iran-related ancestry. This population potentially introduced the Y chromosome haplogroup J1 into the region. So haplogroup J1, it is linked to this ancient Iranian DNA, and ancient Iranians would not be Semites. The haplogroup common in Natufians, E11B, is also frequent in our data set with most lineages. So again, Natufians have haplogroup E. By modeling contemporary populations using ancient genomes, we identified differences between the Levant and Arabia. The Levant today has higher European/Anatolian related ancestry, while Arabia has higher African and Natufian-like ancestry. So again, clearly two different peoples within the modern Middle East, and even this shows anciently as well, that basically we have people with higher European and Anatolian DNA versus people with African and Natufian DNA. And that African and Natufian DNA would be the Semitic, Afro-Asiatic DNA, whereas the European and Anatolian DNA would be the non-Semitic. So let's actually demonstrate that. Genetically, we have different Middle Eastern populations. Genetically, we have Middle Eastern populations with Natufian/African ancestry, and genetically, we have Middle Easterners with Iranian, Anatolian, and Caucasian ancestry. But let's actually visualize this with maps. So here on the left-hand side of your screen is the distribution of Natufian ancestry. And here on the right-hand side of the screen is the distribution of Iranian Neolithic ancestry. As you can see, two completely different genomes of people residing in the Near East. And here's just another map. Again, Natufian ancestry, which would be Afro-Asiatic ancestry. It fits perfectly with Afro-Asiatics. And here is the Iran Neolithic ancestry, and this fits also perfectly with Indo-European languages like the Iranian language. And again, just another map, the Levant Neolithic ancestry, its distribution, and the Iranian Chalcolithic ancestry and its distribution. And basically, we see this ancestry of Levant Neolithic in the Middle East, Africa, and the Mediterranean. So it fits nicely. Basically, if you look at genetic maps, we can see clearly differences in ancestry of Middle Easterners, those with ancient Iranian ancestry and those with ancient Natufian ancestry. Logically, it will make sense that those with Natufian ancestry correspond with Afro-Asiatics, the distribution of Afro-Asiatic peoples. Whereas with the Iranian/Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestry, it corresponds mostly with the Core-Araxes Hurrians as well as Indo-European populations. So here is a map, a simple map of the distribution of Semitic speakers, of Semitic people. Basically, Semites really don't go above the modern-day countries of Syria and Iraq. In ancient times, the Semites really didn't go above those two geographical areas. Basically, the Tigris and Euphrates River. You don't really find too many Semitic populations in places like Anatolia or the Southern Caucasus or Iran. And this fits perfectly with the distribution of Levantine Neolithic DNA, which also doesn't really go above Syria and Iraq, basically the Euphrates and Tigris River. It is seen at very low percentages in places like Anatolia, the Southern Caucasus, and Iran, but very high frequency in places such as the Levant and Arabia, and other parts of the Middle East, Africa, and the Mediterranean. and this fits perfectly with Afro-Asiatics. Given the modern distribution of Semitic languages over the area in question, which belong to the larger Afro-Asiatic family, it seems appropriate to suggest that these first farmers of the Levant and their Mesolithic predecessors, including the Natufian culture, were speaking a Proto-Afro-Asiatic language. It may be that Proto-Semitic continued to develop within the Levant and Syria area, since both Ebelite and Akkadian, early Semitic languages, are attested early, the former around 2400 BC. And again, the Proto-Afro-Asiatic group carrying the E-P2 mutation may have appeared at this point in time and subsequently gave rise to the different major population groups, including current speakers of the Afro-Asiatic languages and pastoralist populations. So again, basically, Natufian ancestry and haplogroup E and Afro-Asiatics, they all perfectly overlap one another. So it's likely that Semites, and if you want to go to a greater extent, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, would have genetically been like this, typical Afro-Asiatic person. Now, Natufian ancestry clearly corresponds with Afro-Asiatic populations and haplogroup E, whereas those with Iranian/Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestry correspond with Core-Araxes, Hurrians/Indo-Europeans. Here is Indo-European Iranian speakers. It shows right here in orange. This is the language families of the Middle East. I advise that you type this in on Google to look at a map of the various languages spoken in the Middle East. And what we're focusing on is in orange, the Indo-European languages, which is spoken in the Middle East, and has in orange the Iranic branch. Hopefully you can see that. But Iranians is basically one of the main languages spoken in the Middle East. And that makes sense because genetically we see Iranians there as well. And so we see, like I showed you earlier, that really Iranian speakers and Semitic speakers, they don't really pass Syria and Iraq. That's kind of like a natural border because this is the area of the Tigris and Euphrates River. So it may be sort of like a natural border. And then you have just a nice, visualization of that. And this fits perfectly with the Iranian Chalcolithic DNA with its highest distribution in places like Iran and the Caucasus. And it goes into Syria and Iraq, but it's not there as high as it is on this part of the world in Iran and the Southern Caucasus. And this fits with the Hurrians. In the period immediately prior to the emergence of the Hurrians, the northern area of their distribution was occupied by the Core-Araxes culture, circa 3400 through 2500 BC. The distribution of Core-Araxes sites would encompass the territory of the Eto and Uratrians, as well as the northern part of the Hurrians. It is often presumed that the Core-Araxes culture is an archaeological reflection of the Hurrians. This geographic distribution of J2A versus J1 mirrors the two autosomal components from Habir et al. 2013. However, several demographic and migratorial events may contribute to the observed Y frequency patterns in the southern Levant. Major J2A lineages whose origin is likely from East Anatolia, Armenia, Georgia, and northwestern Iran, which is all the area of this Iranian DNA, migrated to the southern Levant during the early Bronze Age through the movement of the Core-Araxes horizon to Lebanon, Syria, and ultimately the Galilee area marked by the Khirbek-Kirkwar culture. So, just to illustrate this, the Indo-European homeland, the area of Indo-European speakers, that also overlaps perfectly with haplogroup J, specifically haplogroup J2, which is what seems to be a very strongly Iranian-linked type of haplogroup. And that would make sense because it would seem that like haplogroup J is also linked with ancient Iranian DNA as well. So we see a perfect overlap with the Indo-European people and haplogroup J, because likely a lot of haplogroup J is actually spoken by Indo-European people. There are clearly two peoples that lived in the Middle East in almost every way, geographically, genetically, linguistically, etc. We have the Afro-Asiatic Semites and the Core-Araxes Hurrians. You have Natufian/Ibero-Mauritian ancestry and Iranian/Caucasian ancestry. You have haplogroup E and haplogroup J. Core-Araxes here in the southern Caucasus, Semites here in the Levant. Two completely different areas geographically, migrating from two completely different directions. Semites from the south to the north, Core-Araxes from the north to the south. Core-Araxes people speaking a Caucasian language, Semites speaking an Afro-Asiatic language. So, and haplogroup J being abundant in the Caucasus, haplogroup E being abundant in the Levant. Completely different types of origin and genetics and migration patterns, etc. Furthermore, Semites would autosomally genetically be more Natufian, being more closely akin to Afro-Asiatic peoples, whereas, again, Core-Araxes people would genetically be more akin to Iranians and Caucasus hunter-gatherers. Afro-Asiatic equals Natufian ancestry and haplogroup E, whereas Core-Araxes equals Iranian/Caucasian ancestry and haplogroup J. In terms of Shem to Israel, logically it would make sense that the Israelites and their ancestors would belong to Afro-Asiatic and Natufian stock, since the Israelites descend from Shem, who would, represent Afro-Asiatic Semites. But this is where we end the Afro-Asiatic Semitic versus the Core-Araxes Hurrian. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. Don't forget to subscribe and share the video. Click the bell, leave a comment for any questions you might have, and follow my social media platforms that you are about to see. And with all of that out of the way, have a great day and shalom.